Hi, I'm Kathy King, registered dietitian and founder of Helm Publishing. We provide nutrition-related continuing education self-study courses to dietitians and other health professionals. One of the fastest growing paradigms that we have in the dietetic profession is intuitive eating. We're very lucky today to have one of the co-creators, Evelyn Tribole, of the intuitive eating paradigm. And I'd like to welcome Evelyn. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I love talking about intuitive eating.
Good, good. I will read some of the things from her extensive bio, but I think that you'll find that Evelyn is unbelievable in what some of the things that she's done. She's a registered dietitian and a certified eating disorder specialist. She has authored over 10 books, including The Intuitive Eating, which is now in its 4th edition. Evelyn is an international speaker. We're getting people at our office all the time asking about it and wanting to know if we could send it to Russia and to other places in Europe and Australia and such along that line. She's a popular media guest and was the nutrition expert for Good Morning America and a media spokesperson for the Academy for 6 years. It is interesting to note that Evelyn qualified for the first Olympic women's marathon in 1984, but is now an avid hiker, surfer, and ping pong player. So Evelyn, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And let me start by asking a question that I'm sure many people are asking. In your words, what is intuitive eating?
It's such a good and basic question. And I think it's important to ask because if you go onto social media, what you see represented as intuitive eating sometimes is not really what it is. In fact, it's fascinating. Right now on TikTok, there's almost over 2 billion with the B hashtags on intuitive eating. So there's a lot of interest, which really excites me. And sometimes in the excitement, people don't have all parts of the models correctly. So I'll describe what it is. So intuitive eating is a compassionate self-care eating framework rooted in dignity and respect for all bodies. It's evidence-based. We have 10 principles. There's almost 200 studies now on our work, which is incredibly exciting. And at the root of this, in terms of mechanism, intuitive eating really works by a process called interoceptive awareness. And that's our ability to perceive physical sensations that arise within the body. So that includes things like, feeling a full bladder, hunger and fullness. You can feel your heartbeat rapidly and so forth. But the other thing it also includes, besides satiety cues and biological states, is emotions. Every emotion has a physical sensation. And so when you're tapping into this, it's kind of like your superpower. And I think it's part of the reason why when people say that intuitive eating is life-changing, this is part of what this is, because we start trusting ourselves again. And when someone has been in the throes of diet culture, by whatever name you call it, they end up outsourcing their eating to some guru, some plan at the expense of not knowing themselves, and trust starts to erode. But the good news is this can be rebuilt. It's very, very workable, one bite at a time.
So basically, it's rebuilding your confidence in yourself to be able to make the decisions about what you want to eat.
Yeah, by listening to your body. And it's funny, Kathy, I define this in many different ways, depending on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to teenagers, I'll say, it's basically about no one can be the boss of your body. Only you know what feels good and sounds good for your body and so forth. When I'm talking to scientists, I'm talking more about the mechanisms around interoceptive awareness, but it's about really listening and connecting and bringing the pleasure back to eating. We have such a cultural neurosis around eating, where you're sitting down to a really pleasurable meal. Maybe you haven't seen some of the people for a long time, and then someone is apologizing or explaining why they're eating or not eating whatever it is. And it's like, oh, let's just get back to breaking bread with the connection that implies,
Isn't that true? I think people in our profession have lost a lot of that sometimes.
I think so. Not everyone, but many. Yeah.
Yes, but many. That's exactly right. I would like to ask then, how did you evolve to intuitive eating in your practice? How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting backstory. And 30 years ago, Elise and I were in private practice separately. We're in the same office. I leased from her, and we were working with our clients and seeing so much suffering as a result of dieting. And when we were seeing that our traditionally trained ways was not working either. Patients would come and see us, and then they would come back 2 years later saying that they blew it. And Elise and I were like, you know what? There's something wrong with this system. And so what we did is we did a lot of things. We did a deep dive into the research. We factored in our clinical experience and also what some of the popular books were also saying, written by therapists, like Overcoming Overeating by Hirschman and Munter. And the review of the literature was quite stunning. And I should also mention that, Elise and I both have, backgrounds in eating disorders, and that kind of training and the fact that you're constantly working in a multidisciplinary approach, we're looking at a lot of fields anyways, especially psychology. And that really served us well in terms of creating this model. And I'm not going to name all the studies, but I want to talk about a few key hallmark studies that really just really took our breath away. And one of them was the Minnesota starvation study, that was done during World War II with conscientious objectors. And they put healthy men, biologically healthy, psychologically healthy, put them on a semi-starvation diet and exercise, and then observed the effects because they wanted to help prepare for all the malnutrition that was happening because of the food shortages in the world because of World War II. And what ended up happening stunned the researchers. I actually have the original studies. They're really big. They're like 2 volumes of these 2 giant books. And what happened is these men became obsessed with food. They started collecting recipes and cookbooks. And we have to remember, back then we didn't have, TV shows with celebrity chefs running around, and that's all they could do. And so what this study really did in many ways is really for the first time looked at what are the impacts of food restriction on psychology. So these were healthy men who some of them ended up having eating disorders. For example, one man couldn't stand the rules of the diet. He went out and stole candy, binged on it, felt so guilty he made himself throw up. Another man couldn't stand the rules, and he binged on milkshakes, felt so guilty, made himself throw up as well. Now, when there was 2 parts of the study, the second part of the study, the men were allowed to eat, as much as they wanted to. And during that time, they were insatiable. And we see a lot of these parallels in our clients who've been on a lot of food restrictions for dieting and so forth. So that really informed our work. And then there's a whole area of research called restraint theory. It's also known as the what the hell effect. And I'll never forget reading their original paper. It's like, oh my God, they're describing my patients when someone has restraint. They're really restraining their eating. They have these rules around eating to suppress their body weight and so forth. And then something happens to break the restraint. It can be an emotion, it could be an event, it could be hunger. And what ends up happening, they call it this counter-regulatory effect, where they disconnect from their body and the eating gets into all or none. So that really influenced our model. And then the work of L.L. Birch, who was a renowned researcher on the parent-child feeding relationship. We looked to a lot of her studies showing that well-meaning parents, when they have rigid food restrictions for their kids, and I'm not trying to throw parents under the bus, by the way. I think parenting is the most humbling thing you can do. But what the research showed is when you restrict their eating, those kids become more focused and obsessed on the very foods that they can't have and end up eating more of those and not self-connecting. And then lastly, well, not lastly, but kind of partly, another area of research is habituation. And I'm going to explain what that is and why that is. So one of our most exciting and controversial principles of intuitive eating is make peace with food, which basically means eating what food you like. And there's not a restriction on it. And so this is based around the research of habituation. Habituation is about novelty, and that is when something's new, it's very exciting. And one of the best ways I've heard it described from a researcher is that, imagine you're falling in love with somebody for the first time. And for the first time, you hear this person say, I love you. And it's amazing, it's magical, you're floating on air. Say 5 years later, you're in a relationship, committed relationship, that same person says, I love you. And it's nice to hear. but it doesn't have that same effect. And so what happens when people are chronically dieting, they don't get that habituation effect. Food stays very exciting. And when they break the rules of their diet, they have false, evidence that, oh, I can't stay on my diet. So they think they need to have rigid rules. So rigid rule is part of the problem. And this is also about removing the morality from our eating. You're not good or bad based on what you eat and so forth, and to really help reconnect with the joy of eating. And then lastly, this is a personal influence, Kathy. I was really lucky. I feel this early in my career. I was on a task force that Julia Child created, putting dietitians and chefs together. And we would meet once a month. And this was so long ago. We would be in this meeting and her voice would come out on this speaker. I never got to meet her, but I will never forget her voice. I felt like one of Charlie's Angels, having this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so, because she was concerned about the neurosis happening around the dinner table, that people are so worried about what they're eating, what you're going to eat is going to kill or cure you kind of thing. And so with working with all these chefs, we came to this really fundamental agreement that sounds kind of basic now, but at the time it was revolutionary. And that, to the dietitians, whenever you're recommending some kind of, medical nutrition therapy, please, for the love of God, consider taste. And then to the chefs, consider, some nutrition when you're planning your meals and so forth. And so we really got in to the pleasure of eating. And pleasure is an important part of satisfaction, which is one of our principles as well. So there's a lot more to it, but that just gives you kind of a taste of how we got to be where we are. And then that's the first part of the evolution. The second part was, this is where we got really, really lucky. Our publisher loved our manuscript. And when they read it, they said, we really, really love it, but we'd like you to turn it into like steps or something, make it more how to, as opposed to this big tome on, eating. So that's how we created 10, we divided it into 10 principles. And what that did, it made it measurable. And so a researcher out of the Ohio State University, Tracy Tilka, created the first intuitive eating assessment scale. And what it did, it put intuitive eating on the scientific map. And basically they asked, can we define who the intuitive eater is? And so what, does it matter? And the answer was yes, and yes, and yes, it matters, and it makes a huge difference. And right now, a study's underway on looking at the third revision of this particular scale. So, and that, when that happened, then that was accessible to other researchers, in which they can do different interventions or studies with intuitive eating and have a measurement, which makes it so incredibly exciting.
We have at Helm Publishing a portion of the certification for counselors that want to go for the intuitive eating certification. Around the world, people are interested in this. Could you tell us, what is the intuitive eating certification that counselors can do, and how do they get it?
Yeah, and it's really interesting how this was an evolution as well. And what started happening as our book became popular, health professionals started implementing it in their practices, and sometimes they were implementing it in ways that we had no intention of it being implemented. And so we thought, in order to have fidelity in our process, we started training and then certifying health professionals, so that readers of our work, or now people in social media, wherever they are, they can find somebody who's been trained in the method. And the thing I find really interesting about this is that, a lot of dietitians have gone through this training, and they often begin with, oh, I've read the book, I'm familiar, and they're doing their thing. And then they take the training and they go, oh my gosh, I had no idea there was so much nuance to it and so much research, because I really do get into the research, so you can really have a good foundation on this. And so basically there's 3 core steps. The first step is the self-study, which your company, Helm Publishing, administers the test and the materials for that. The second step is taking the intuitive eating pro skills training. That's what I do. It's a 7-week program, 6 weeks of all kinds of content information, and the 7th one just being purely question and answers. And then this third step is doing something called supervision. And that's something we've borrowed from the field of psychology. And basically what it is like master coaching. And so what ends up happening as you're going through this process, you're getting more and more refined with the intuitive eating process. And in this case, if you're doing it in a group process, there's a total of 8 people plus myself. And so it's very small, very interactive. And that's where you get to process your cases, your questions. You don't have to be working with anybody to do this. You can still work with hypothetical cases and so forth. And then there's also the individual option. You don't have to do it in a group process. So those are the 3 major steps. And we generally recommend going in that order, doing the self-study, then doing the training with me, and then doing the supervision process.
For people who are interested, our self-study was in collaboration with Evelyn and Elise. So you have their book as one part of it with all the questions that are on it. And then you have a workbook, you have their ebook, and you have the audio book. And there's questions for all of it. There's really in-depth information that helps give you a basis before you go start taking the professional supervision and really get into the application of a lot of it. People have given us wonderful feedback on the whole process. And I'm appreciative to you all for being able to be smart enough to be able to pull this off.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's been a win-win relationship, because I thought, anyways, it's been a wonderful relationship. But the thing that's so cool now, we have a variety of health professionals in over 40 countries now who are certified. And, we decided to open this up to not just dietitians, but to anybody working in the field of health. And I have to say that I have to credit Elise for that idea, because it's been really powerful and very synergistic. Now we have to keep in mind scope of practice. What a psychologist will do within the framework of intuitive eating can look different than a dietitian. The framework is the same, but the depth is what would be different. And then about 5 years, so was it 5 years ago? Maybe we added the lay facilitator category, because we kept getting so many requests from people whose lives have changed through the work, and they want to help lead a support group, like in their community or in their church or something like that. And they actually go through the same training. It's just a scope of practice kind of issue.
Yes, and limitations on it. So if you could give us an idea of what are the perks of becoming certified in intuitive eating?
Yeah, I mean, we want our readers to find people that have been certified. So we've done a lot to help that happen. So we have a directory, a certified intuitive eating counselor directory online that's been search engine optimized, and where people can go and see who they're. Well, let's say if you're looking for a psychologist, dietitian, maybe a coach, maybe a trainer, you can go onto the directory and search it by your location and what you're looking for and find them that way. And for the health professionals, one other thing that we have on there besides, putting it into your background, we have links for your media, so we can kind of get to know you, and when you're thinking about who you want to work with. We also have a logo that says trained and certified by the original intuitive eating pros, just to kind of help them stand out, like because people what's happening is people are encroaching on our work. Diet culture is encroaching on our work, and so this little logo can help in that way. And the other thing we have is we have a private community on Facebook just for certified intuitive eating counselors, where we lift each other up in terms of things that are going on, research that's going on. It's a really nice and engaging community. So those are some things to look forward to.
I want to thank you for being with us today. This was very exciting and interesting, and you are going to come back at another time and we'll have more questions for you. And so thank you very much. And you've been listening to information on intuitive eating with Evelyn Tribole. This is Kathy King with Helm Publishing, and we wish you good health.